reading of this morning's gospel, which comes to us from St. Luke. Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And that is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. So I have an apology this morning. I watched too much football last night. I got way too involved emotionally. I have nothing to say this morning. Just kidding. You're not that lucky. So if you've been paying attention to the lectionary, along with the Gospels from Luke, right alongside of it, there have been readings from Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. Thank you, Susie Fielder, for reading this morning from Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, talking about spiritual gifts, making our way through chapters 11 and 12 of Paul's letter. And we will wrap those teachings up next Sunday with 1 Corinthians chapter 13, perhaps one of the finest pieces of literature in Western civilization, Paul's writing on the spiritual gift of love. And because I'm going to preach on that next Sunday, I want to let you know what the gospel for next Sunday is, because it follows immediately on the heels of Jesus' first sermon. And as you may remember, it did not go well with the homies. After he preached this sermon, he made it known that this message was to go out to the Gentiles as well, and for that, they wanted to throw him off the cliff. Good start. You know, I've preached a lot of bad sermons. I've offended a lot of people. I suppose that's one of my jobs. But no one ever really wanted to kill me. And I guess that's what the effect of a good sermon would probably be. But anyway, this is, Jesus is coming out. This is the first public appearance that Luke writes about. It says that, he went back home to the Galilee, to the region, known just as, the land of the Gentiles. And he goes to the hometown in Nazareth. And we don't really know how big Nazareth was. It certainly wasn't anywhere near as big as Calistoga. Maybe, maybe 50 families, maybe, the reason that people say, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Not because Nazareth was that bad a place, but it was just obscure. They were all obscure. Nazareth, Tiberias, Capernaum, Nain, they were just out back. They were, backwater. And so he goes back home and preaches a sermon basically from the book of the prophet Isaiah. And it made me start thinking about inaugural addresses, public speeches that are normally very carefully choreographed. For example, if you were running for a political office, the first speech that you gave, you'd pay a lot of attention to it. So I just happened to Google inaugural speeches, and it turns out that a number of years ago, a journalist from the Washington Post put together a little article called The 12 Most Influential Inaugural Addresses in History. And I started reading. It's pretty interesting. And some of them because they're good, some of them because they're not so good. But I didn't know this, that the longest inaugural address was given by William Henry Harrison, not a household name, in 1841. It was freezing cold. It was the longest inaugural address. It took almost 2 hours. 2 hours for Harrison to deliver it in the freezing cold. And what was amazing about the address is not the content, but what he was wearing, because he had no overcoat, no hat, and he wound up contracting pneumonia and died 30 days later. Good inaugural address. People anymore talk about how divided the country is. Oh, we're so divided, How quickly we forget. Wasn't that long ago that the Supreme Court had to make the decision between George W. and Al Gore? I mean, the election, remember the hanging chads? And there were more protests, a lot more protests surrounding the presidential speech of George W. than there have been recently. A lot more. Now, Woodrow Wilson, this is interesting to me. Woodrow Wilson, this is 1917, and Woodrow Wilson's platform, in other words, one of the main things that he talked about in his run for the presidency is that he would not involve the United States in World War I. We're not sending troops to Europe. That's the political platform that he ran on. At the inaugural address, one of the things that Woodrow Wilson says is that the United States can no longer remain neutral to the conflict in Europe. We're sending troops. Truman really ushered in what's known as the Cold War. The Cold War. And this is the discrepancy, the inevitable with communism and democracy. And Truman said, there's a lot of people that believe this way, there's a lot of people that believe this way, and batten the hatches, kids, it's going to get ugly. And Truman, kind of rang that bell. Now, in 1980, Ronald Reagan came along, Ronald Reagan being a Republican, and Ronald Reagan said, government is not the solution to America's problems. And this spoke to a political ethos, really. The Republicans generally don't believe that government should get any bigger or involve itself any more in democracy than it absolutely has to. Now, that was Reagan's platform. Government is not the solution. Now, Clinton comes along as a Democrat, and he said, government is not the problem, and government is not the solution. The people of the United States are the solution to America's problems. So there you have the philosophies kind of, one beside each other, and, they always go at it, and they divide the country. Jefferson, you think things are bad and divided now. I mean, have you read a history book? I mean, really? When you talk about conflict and disagreements philosophically, economically, geographically, every conceivable way, what we're going through now is child's play. Really. Keep it in perspective. This is Jefferson's, the way he ended his inaugural address. This is 1801. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists in an effort to kind of be of one mind. Well, How effective was that? When it comes down to things that people and presidents have actually said, there are two really only that stand out. All of you remember John Kennedy, again, not a warm day in Washington, D.C. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The only question I hear people asking now is, what can they do for me? I don't care about anything else. It's a great line, though. It's a great line. And then, when the country was really in the dumper. Our parents might have a little bit, the Depression. I'm curious how many in this room or watching this particular service have ever gone hungry involuntarily. No real hunger. No real hunger. And how many of us have had skills, real, academic, accomplished, PhD, master's, whatever, college education, and not been able to find work? Sweeping floors, pitching burgers, no work, no food, no provision for family. That's the Depression. That's the Depression. And that's a dark chapter. And here comes FDR. FDR himself struggling with enormous physical challenges. It's one thing to be richer than God. It's another thing to have the physical ability to even enjoy a breath. And he takes the helm. One of the most amazing presidencies ever. What did he say? What did he say? There's only one thing we have to be afraid of. Only one thing. That's being afraid. I'm telling you, there's a lot of different ways to respond to this pandemic. Some of them healthy, some of them not so much. But there's no question. You can ask any historian, what's the greatest? Really, what was the finest hour of an inaugural address? And it turns out it happens to have been the shortest. And I should take a hint from that about sermons. But all of you know this. The Gettysburg Address was a good warm-up. But here it is, 1865, and the Civil War was about 5 weeks away. Lee was about 5 weeks away from surrendering in Appomattox. 5 weeks away. Lincoln was about 30 days away from being assassinated. And here's Abraham Lincoln. And, we can imagine internal strife. What, are you kidding me? The Civil War? We can imagine the toll that division would take on a country. What, are you kidding me? And so Lincoln is, here he is. He's going for a second round. And it's looking like the war is winding down, and the problems are only beginning. If you've never read any piece of journalism about Lincoln, you need to read Gary Will's comments on the second inaugural address and the challenges that were facing the country and specifically the presidency at that time. But, here's Honest Abe winding it up in 1865. This is pretty good. Pretty good. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we have begun, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for those who have borne the burden of battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which we may to achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So Jesus didn't really take the pulpit. In fact, the liturgy of the synagogue was run almost exclusively by lay people, especially in smaller outbacks like Nazareth. And so Jesus stands up, and I don't know if he volunteered to do the reading, if it had been, arranged by the one who oversaw the liturgy that day or not. But, clearly there was a buzz. There was a buzz in the air. People were talking. The rumors were flying around the Galilee. Have you heard about this kid from Nazareth? And so there was a buzz. It's kind of like the buzz before the football game last night. I mean, I love George Kittle, who said, hey, freezing temperatures, Lambeau Field, championship football, San Francisco 49ers, Green Bay Packers. It doesn't get any better. There's a buzz. There's a buzz. Well, there was a buzz in the synagogue. And, there might be a lot of times in a lot of places that you would have been born on the planet just because it would have been an interesting time. But, the Galilee in the year 0 with Herod and Roman occupations, that wasn't it. That wasn't it. So into this milieu, Jesus stands up and it says, Luke is very careful. He found where in the book of the prophet Isaiah it said. He found it. In other words, not like here where when Susie came up and when Rosemary came up, they knew exactly what they were going to read. These are assigned, have been for plus or minus 1,500 years. They knew exactly. Did Jesus know exactly? Was he looking for something specific? He found in the prophet where it said. And so he reads it. Now, this wouldn't have fallen on deaf ears. Everybody in the synagogue would have known this passage from the book of the prophet Isaiah. They're all waiting for something to happen. They're all ready for God to balance the table. I mean, life is terrible. What? Come on. Do something. And so Jesus announces his messianic mission. Now, as important as inaugural addresses are, and I find great irony in the fact that inaugural addresses are hot air on really cold days. That the first thing that these gospel authors do set the tone, don't they, for the rest of the story. For example, last week, what did we have? We had the first thing that Jesus does in John's Gospel, the wedding at Cana. No joy. But Jesus brings new wine. New wine. There's going to be joy. Luke, the preaching in the synagogue. Mark casts out the demon. Matthew, Sermon on the Mount, setting the stage, casting the vision. This is how it's going to play out from now on. And it's not about you. And this is what disappointed the people in Nazareth so much. When Jesus said, this thing is big. It's not about you. And here's what it's about. It's about people on the edges. It's about the poor. It's about the oppressed. It's about setting people free from any kind of prison that they may be locked in. That's the mission. That's why we're here. To make the world the place that God created it to be, rather than the place that it so often finds itself. And each of the gospel authors wanted very clearly to see that there's a new focus for our intention. You know, when people gather for inaugurations, what they're hoping for is it's a messianic hope. You know, half the people who attend them, half the people who pay attention to them are hoping that this will be the one. This will be the answer. This will be the one that will tie up, bind us together and put it out, and we'll return to a land of love and freedom and all that. And the other half, not so much. And it's just always been that way. So whatever you do, don't let it get you down. You see people, oh, no. Well, there's no faith in that. There's no hope in that. And what we'll hear next week is that Paul says, there's only three things. There's only three things. There's only faith. Faith in what? There's only hope. And of course, there's only love. Yeah.
Contributions to St. Luke's Episcopal Church help to make the digital ministry and other outreach within the community possible. If it is in your heart to make a donation, St. Luke's secure PayPal link, as well as the church's mailing information, may be found in the description of this video. Thank you.